My name is Rebecca Jepson, and I'm self-employed, but my affiliation with SMART is through working with a community-based monitoring network with the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board in the Canadian Arctic. This story will be maybe a little different from some others that you hear this week for a couple of reasons. One is that the data collection is actually done by subsistence hunters. And the other is that it's in a very cold place, whereas a lot of the SMART work we've been hearing about so far has been in warm places. So it's a tale of Inuit ecological monitoring in the Canadian Arctic. And just a note that Inuit are the indigenous people of Arctic Canada. And in their language, Inuktitut, it just means people. So once upon a time in Nunavut is where our story begins. And just to orient you with where this is, Nunavut, as I mentioned, is in the Canadian Arctic. And it's this entire red area. The globe maybe here looks a little different than what you're used to seeing because it's looking at the Earth from the North Pole. It's the best way to kind of represent this area on the planet. So Nunavut is an area that is 1.9 million kilometers squared, and there are about 40,000 residents spread across this area. So it's an area about the same size as Western Europe, with 40,000 people spread throughout it. 85% of these are Inuit, and they live in 26 remote communities. So these are communities that have fly-in only access. There's no roads to them or from them or between them. Historically, the Inuit culture was nomadic, and that was the case up until the 1950s. And since then, there's continued subsistence harvesting. So again, because of the remoteness of the communities, all of the food has to be flown in regularly. If there's a blizzard for a week and there's one store in a town of 2,000 people, there's no food. So you need to have a caribou and some fish under your house that you can pull out and feed your family. And the Inuit worldview is that Inuit are part of nature. So they consider themselves part of the ecosystem and part of the natural world. So once upon a time in Nunavut, there was a wildlife co-management system. And very briefly, co-management simply means that the government and the indigenous people are working together cooperatively to manage wildlife. In Nunavut, there is something called the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement. It's basically a modern treaty that forms the foundation of wildlife management, among other things. And it recognizes the principles of wildlife conservation, habitat protection, and the right to harvest for Inuit people. And the main instrument of wildlife management in the territory is the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board. And they follow the principles of conservation and science, and also of traditional knowledge. So traditional knowledge had ruled the land and its animals for centuries. So Inuit traditional knowledge tends to be holistic. It doesn't look at one species or one ecosystem in isolation. It looks at the entire world and how it's interconnected. And because of that, it tends to cover very large areas and very long time frames. It's also generally very qualitative in nature. Science, on the other hand, tends to be fairly directed in study and quantitative. And because of the vastness of the Arctic and the really high costs of doing research there, scientific research in the north of Canada tends to be over very small areas and for relatively short time frames. Community-based monitoring tends to try to bridge that gap between the two knowledge systems. And it does that essentially by tapping into existing monitoring systems. So what I mean by that is when people go out hunting, when they go on the land, they'll come back and tell their family and their friends, you know, it was a good hunt, but the snow was soft, or the ice was opening up already in this area, or we saw lots of caribou to the north. That type of general information sharing is essentially local monitoring. So community-based monitoring allows us to take that type of information and quantify it and essentially produce knowledge co-production. So the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board launched the community-based monitoring network in 2012 with the following objectives: to gather knowledge directly from those who spend the most time on the land, to improve information available for use in decision-making, to acquire data and traditional knowledge to identify important management zones and critical biodiversity and harvesting areas, to maintain a progressive, up-to-date management system, to document traditional knowledge in a format that can communicate with scientific modeling, and to maximize benefits for participating communities. And this is done through capacity building and an incentive program. As the community-based monitoring network grew, we ran into some technical difficulties. It was originally started using a custom-built app from a for-profit developer that had relatively limited flexibility. So we had a high dependence on the developer for the administration of the program, for data access, review, and analysis. There was no option for export of the data. And that's all led to very high operational costs, which in turn limited the potential for program growth. So a search was launched in 2020 to find a solution. We were looking for something that was an adaptable system to collect, store, manage, and use data. We needed decentralized management. So because everything is so spread out over such a large area, it was really important to be able to have that remote feed in. Multilingual capacity, so it needed to work in both English and Inuktitut. We needed automated standardized reporting, and it needed to accommodate historical data. So at this point, there were about 12,000 patrols and 14,000 observation records in the database that needed to be brought in. And everywhere we looked, we found SMART. So in 2020, 2021, the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board teamed up with SMART through the North Carolina Zoo, and the data model was adapted to the existing data collection forms, which made training and transition very easy. It had mobile functionality, so harvesters could suddenly start using their own phones and devices instead of having to have special devices that were programmed with the other app. This allowed for enhanced data management and access, user account management, and custom-built reports. So SMART was first deployed for this project in October of 2021, and it immediately increased accessibility. So we had custom icons and Inuktitut, which allowed a lot of people who were unilingual or did not read to be able to collect data for the first time. There's also limited technical input required. So once we learned how to work SMART and how to manage it ourselves, you don't need to keep going back all the time for more assistance. And this in turn minimized costs of the program. And the crowds went wild. So since SMART was deployed, so in 2021, we've had 818 harvesters registered for the program across 10 communities. They've collected over 24,000 patrols, more than 5,000 observation records, close to 13,000 harvest records, and logged over 2.6 million kilometers of patrol data. Okay, I have the wrong presentation that's still in here. Anyway, we just had a time series that showed the number of patrols and how that had increased since the implementation of SMART. So in the year 2020, it was just about 960 patrols, and we're currently at over 7,000 so far for the year 2025. This is just a quick export of a map that shows the patrol data. And if you note in the bottom corner of the screen, the immense scale of this, that's 400 kilometers on the scale bar. If I zoom into one of these communities, just to give you an idea of how this looks, this is from Nauyat, so one of the communities that's participating. And the lines between the communities that you can see here are traveled by either boat or ski-doo, like snowmobile. So again, there's no roads that interconnect them. And this is just another community that has all of the observation and harvest locations. You can't see the community name because it's buried in the center of all the blue dots, but it just gives you an idea of how much data we're collecting from some of these communities now. So in 2023, we had a data engagement and knowledge sharing workshop, and we had 22 elders, women, and active harvesters from 9 Nunavut communities come together with scientists and researchers to discuss the value of the data to the communities and to gain an understanding of the context within which the data could be analyzed, interpreted, and applied. Generally speaking, it was felt that the patrol data reflects land use well in communities with more data collectors, which is not surprising. If you don't have too many people collecting data and contributing, then you don't end up with as much data that looks representative of what's happening in the community. They also felt that not all species were well represented in the observation data. So for the harvest records, they felt that it was a good representation of what was happening, but felt that people were not necessarily recording what they observed as often as it was actually observed by people on the land. So as an example, bowhead whales and polar bears are both seen a lot more often than were shown in the database. One of the biggest outcomes was that the data products themselves from within SMART were very useful. So the maps and the queries and the reports that we were actually able to generate in real time at the workshop in response to the discussions really helped out with achieving the workshop objectives. The moral of the story is kind of twofold. This piece was from one of the elders that attended the workshop. And he said that every waypoint of the community-based monitoring network data is traditional knowledge. And by that, he meant that harvesters are where they are on the land at a specific moment in time because of what they've been taught and because of what they know. So it is really a quantified database of the traditional knowledge. And lastly, that SMART has played a key role in bringing this knowledge of the land to data in hand. That's all. Thank you.